They left her out there to die, but not in a way that was quick, not with a bang. They left her out there for the sun, for the quiet, for the kind of slow, baking death that only the Mojave knows how to deliver. It was one of those July months in Ridgerest where the air gets so thick and hot it feels like you're breathing wool. The sun beats down with a kind of personal hatred, the kind that cracks old fence posts and makes the horizon shimmer with lies. Out here, you learn to read the silence. And the silence on this day was wrong. Jack Mercer felt it in his bones. At 42, he'd lived enough life to fill 3 coffins. He'd buried a younger brother who took a bullet meant for him, watched his family home burn to black embers over a card game gone sour, and held the hand of a woman who promised him forever, right before she walked away with a traveling salesman who promised her the world. Jack wasn't a soft man. The desert had boiled that out of him years ago. But what he saw that day, standing at the edge of his property, that's the kind of wrong that scrapes its nails down the chalkboard of your soul. She was just there, by the one fence post he'd been meaning to fix for a solid decade. Her feet were bare, cracked and bleeding on the baked dirt. Her dress, a simple thing that might have been white once, was soaked and stained up to her knees. Her wrists were bound tight in front of her with thick rope, the kind that leaves scars you can read like a story. And over her head, cinched tight at the neck, was a grain sack, thick burlap, no eye holes, no room to breathe, no mercy. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't crying out. She was just standing there, stock still under that hateful sun, like a scarecrow waiting for birds that would never come. Waiting like she already knew nobody was ever coming for her. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen something so fundamentally broken it makes your own teeth ache in sympathy? Jack swung a leg over his horse, Dusty, the old gelding, letting out a soft snort. He didn't call out. He didn't reach for the rifle in its scabbard. Words felt too loud for a scene like this. He just walked, slow, careful, like a man approaching a wounded animal that might just be playing dead. The ground crunched under his boots. Each step felt like a drum beat in the suffocating quiet. He got closer, 10 feet, then 5. He could see the rope burns on her wrists, red and angry. He could see the slight tremble in her frame, the only sign she was even alive. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't a voice. It was a sound. The sound of rustling dead leaves. The sound of a key scraping a rusty lock. It was so dry it cracked right in the middle of a word. "Please," she whispered, so low he almost missed it. "Take it off." It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. The last request from a woman who had nothing left to ask for. Jack's hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor, reached for the knot under her chin. It wasn't a simple knot. It was tied with a special kind of malice. It was a hangman's knot, but tied to choke, not to break. It was meant to be permanent. It took him a full 3 minutes, his thick fingers fumbling, his breath held tight in his chest, before the rope finally gave way. He pulled the sack away. And what he saw underneath, it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a demon. It was just a girl. Maybe 19, with fiery red hair that fell in a tangled mess around a face pale with terror and exhaustion. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were wide and unfocused. But that wasn't what made Jack's blood run cold. There on her forehead, just below the hairline, was a mark, a brand. It was a strange, spiraling symbol, seared right into her skin. It was ugly and jagged, an old wound, but one that was clearly meant to be seen, a permanent label. Jack had seen brands on cattle his whole life. He'd never seen one on a person, and in that one horrifying moment, he knew this wasn't just cruelty. This was something else entirely. This was a message. She didn't say anything else. She just stood there, swaying slightly, the world coming back into focus. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who did this or why. The brand on her forehead asked all the questions that mattered. He just put a gentle hand on her arm, and it felt like touching a ghost. He helped her onto Dusty's back, her small frame barely making the old horse flinch. He climbed up behind her and nudged the horse into a slow, deliberate walk back toward the cabin that he called home. The ride was silent. but it was a heavy silence, the kind of quiet that's full of unspoken horrors. With every step the horse took, Jack could feel the slight tremor running through her body. He was a man who'd seen the worst of the world, or so he thought. But the brand on this girl's forehead told him there were darker corners out there than he had ever imagined. And as they rode toward the faint light of his cabin, he had a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't just bringing home a victim, he was bringing home a storm, and it was already on the horizon. Back at the cabin, the world felt a little smaller, a little safer. The thick adobe walls kept out the worst of the sun's glare. Jack poured her a tin cup of water from the barrel. She took it with hands that shook so badly he had to steady them with his own. She drank it in slow, painful sips, like she'd forgotten how. He didn't have much, but he cut up the last of his potatoes and boiled them with a little salt. He gave her the bigger half, pushing the plate toward her without a word. She ate with the quiet desperation of someone who hadn't seen food in days, but still she ate with a strange kind of dignity. She didn't spill a drop. She sat by the cold hearth, wrapped in one of his old scratchy wool blankets, and just stared into the empty fireplace. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece, a clock that hadn't worked in years. Jack didn't push. He knew better. You can't force a story out of someone, especially when that story is written in scars. You just had to wait for them to be ready to read it aloud. Finally, she looked up at him. Her sea-green eyes seemed to look right through him, seeing all the cracks and broken pieces he kept hidden. "They said it was a curse," she whispered, her voice a little stronger now. "They said if a man looked at it too long, he'd be cursed too." She pointed a trembling finger toward her own forehead, toward the brand. Jack didn't even blink. He just took a slow sip of his water and met her gaze. "Doesn't sound like a curse," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Sounds like something cowards would say to justify their own evil." For the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't fear crossed her face. It was almost a smile. Small, crooked, but it was there. It was a start. He offered her the cot in the corner, the one his brother used to sleep on. He took the floor by the door, his old shotgun laid out beside him. Not because he was afraid of her, but because he was afraid of what might be following her. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that brand, that ugly spiraling mark. It wasn't just a symbol of cruelty. It felt ancient. It felt like a warning. And the next morning, the first sign of the curse she'd talked about showed up. It wasn't a plague of locusts. It wasn't a storm of fire. It was much quieter than that. He went out to the well to draw water for the morning, the same well he'd used every single day for 20 years. He dropped the bucket down, heard the familiar splash, and began to pull it back up. But when the bucket surfaced, the water wasn't clear. It was black, thick and foul, with a greasy sheen on the surface. And floating in the middle of it was a single dead raven, its eyes wide open, staring up at the sky. Jack stood there, the rope cold in his hands, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. He'd never seen anything like it. The well was deep, covered. There was no way for a bird to just fall in. It had been put there. He looked back at the cabin, where the girl was now standing in the doorway watching him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. She saw the bird. She saw the water, and she knew. "It's starting," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I told you." Jack didn't believe in curses. He believed in men, and he knew that men were far more dangerous than any superstition. This wasn't magic. This was a threat. He emptied the bucket, his jaw set tight. He would have to ride to the creek for water now, a 5-mile round trip. It was an inconvenience designed to wear him down, to make him see her as a burden. But as he saddled Dusty, he noticed something else. The gate to his horse corral, a heavy wooden gate he always barred shut at night, was wide open. His other horse, a young mare, was gone. There were tracks in the dirt, 2 sets of shod hoof prints leading away from his ranch. They hadn't just opened the gate. They'd stolen from him. They were testing him, prodding him, seeing how much he would take before he broke. He looked over at the girl. She was trying to make herself useful, sweeping the porch with a worn-out broom, but her movements were jerky, fearful. She flinched every time a gust of wind rattled the windows. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just sit here and wait for them to pick his ranch apart piece by piece. "Stay inside," he told her, his voice low and firm. "Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone." She just nodded, her eyes full of a terrible, resigned understanding. Jack rode out, not toward the creek, but toward Ridgerest. The town was little more than a dusty street with a saloon, a general store, and a sheriff's office. Word travels fast in a place that small, faster than a wildfire in a dry canyon. And he knew, deep down, that the stories would have already started. The moment he walked into the saloon, the low hum of conversation died. Every eye turned to him. They weren't curious looks. They were cold, accusatory. The bartender, a man named Silas, who Jack had known for years, wouldn't even meet his eye. He just kept wiping down the same spot on the bar over and over. An old drunk in the corner, a man named Jeb, finally broke the silence. "Heard you picked up some trouble, Jack," Jeb slurred, a nasty grin on his face. "Some folks are saying you brought the devil's own bride to your doorstep." "I brought a girl home, Jeb," Jack said, his voice even. "Someone left her for dead." "That's not what we heard," another man chimed in from a back table. "We heard she's marked. One of them cursed ones from the territories. The kind that sours the milk and brings the fever." Jack scanned the room. He saw fear in their eyes. But it was a greedy kind of fear. The kind that looks for someone to blame for their own miserable lives. They weren't just gossiping. They were turning on him. This was their doing. The poisoned well, the stolen horse. It was a message not just from the men who left her, but from the town itself. They wanted her gone, and they wanted Jack to be the one to do it. He walked out of the saloon without another word, the silence pressing in on his back. He knew he was on his own. The town had already convicted her, and him along with her. But just as he was about to mount his horse, Sheriff Brody stepped out of his office. Brody was a big man, running to fat, with a shiny badge that was cleaner than his conscience. "Jack," he said, his voice trying for friendly and failing. "A word." Jack waited. "Listen," Brody said, lowering his voice. "I know you're a good man, but you've stirred up a hornet's nest with this one. People are spooked. The stories about that girl. They ain't new. They say she came from a settlement up north that burned to the ground. Only one to walk out. They say she brings ruin wherever she goes." "And you believe that?" Jack asked, his voice flat. Brody shifted his weight, avoiding the question. "What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is that some very influential people want her back. They see her as their property. You're interfering with business, Jack. She's a person, Brody, not a piece of property." "Not to them, she ain't," the sheriff said, his eyes hardening. "She's a liability, a loose end, and they will come to collect. My advice? You cut her loose. Leave her on the edge of town. Let 'em find her. It ain't your fight." The threat was clear. The sheriff wasn't here to help. He was here to deliver a warning. He was on their side. Jack just stared at him for a long moment. He saw the cowardice in the sheriff's eyes, the easy choice being made. He got on his horse without another word and rode out of town, the weight of every silent stare on his back. The ride home was heavy. He knew now that this was bigger than two men, bigger than some petty cruelty. There was money involved. Influential people. An entire town ready to turn a blind eye. And a girl with a brand on her forehead, waiting for him in a cabin that was no longer a home, but a fortress. When he got back, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and red. The girl was still inside. He'd been gone for hours and the bar was still across the door. He knocked, a specific rhythm he'd taught her before he left. The bar slid back, and she opened the door, her face etched with worry. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said, stepping inside and barring the door behind him. "But we'll be ready." As darkness fell, an unnatural quiet settled over the ranch. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the desert night. It was the quiet of a hell breath, the quiet before the storm. Jack sat in his chair by the door, the shotgun across his lap. The girl sat by the hearth, not looking at the empty fireplace anymore, but at him. "You should let me go," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He's right. It isn't your fight. They put a brand on you, Jack said, his voice a low growl. They poisoned my well and stole my horse. They made it my fight. You don't understand, she said, a new urgency in her voice. She stood up and came closer, the firelight from the single lantern catching the terror in her eyes. It's not just them, the brand. It's a claim. It means I belong to the prophet. Jack froze. The prophet? He leads them, she whispered, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. A whole community. They call themselves the children of the new dawn. They believe the world is corrupt and that they are chosen to cleanse it. They follow him without question. He's the one who gives the marks. Suddenly it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a band of outlaws. This was a cult. The influential people the sheriff mentioned. The fear in the town. It all made a horrifying kind of sense. They weren't just trying to get back a piece of property. They were trying to silence a heretic. Someone who had escaped. What did you do? Jack asked, his voice low. Why did they cast you out? She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I didn't do anything. I saw something. The prophet. He's not what they think. He's a monster. I saw what he did to a girl who defied him. He didn't just cast her out. He sacrificed her to the desert, and I was next. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with the weight of her confession. She hadn't just run away. She was a witness, the only person who could expose their sainted prophet for the murderer he was. And that's when they heard it. The sound of hoofbeats, not 2 riders this time. It sounded like a dozen. They weren't coming fast. They were coming slow, deliberate, confident. The sound of men who believed they had God on their side. Jack stood up, cocking the shotgun. The click echoed in the tiny cabin like a death sentence. The girl backed away from the door, her face a mask of pure terror. It's them, she breathed. He sent them for me. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the fence. A voice cut through the night, cold and clear. It wasn't loud, but it carried an unnerving authority. Jack Mercer, we know she's in there. The prophet, in his mercy, has offered you a choice. Send out the marked woman, and you will be spared. Harbor the sinner, and your home will become your tomb. You have 1 minute to decide. Jack looked at the girl. She was shaking, her eyes screwed shut, chanting something under her breath. A prayer, maybe, or a curse. He looked at the door. He looked at the shotgun in his hands. He was one man against a dozen, a cult of fanatics, with the town and the law already on their side. The sheriff's words echoed in his mind. It ain't your fight. But then he looked at the girl again, at the raw terror on her face and the ugly brand on her forehead, and he knew the sheriff was wrong. This was the only fight that had ever mattered. The minute was up. The voice called out again, colder this time. Your time is up, Mercer. You have chosen damnation. A torch flared to life in the darkness, then another and another. The yard was suddenly lit by an eerie, flickering orange light. Jack could see them now, at least 10 of them, sitting on their horses just beyond the fence. They weren't dressed like cowboys. They wore simple, dark clothing. Their faces were grim, their eyes burning with a righteous fire. And in the lead, sitting on a black stallion, was a man Jack recognized from the saloon posters. A man with a long, cruel face and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His name was Elias Thorne, known to be the prophet's right-hand man, his enforcer. You are sheltering a blasphemer? Thorne boomed, his voice echoing across the yard. An apostate who has betrayed the holy word of the prophet. She is unclean. She will bring ruin upon this house. Jack didn't answer. He just stood by the window, a sliver of curtain pulled back, watching them. The girl had crumpled to the floor behind the table, her hands over her ears as if to block out the words. We don't want to shed your blood, Mercer, Thorne continued, his voice taking on a sickeningly reasonable tone. We are men of peace, but we will cleanse this land of her taint. Open your door. Give her to us. It is the will of the prophet. Jack's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet. You tell your prophet to come get her himself. A ripple of anger went through the men on horseback. Thorne, however, smiled. It was a cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. So be it. The stubborn mule must be broken. He raised a hand, and two of the men dismounted. They weren't carrying guns. They were carrying something else. Heavy sacks. Jack watched as they walked to the well, the one he knew was already poison. They emptied their sacks into it. More dead things. But this was different. They chanted as they did it, low and guttural. Then they moved to his small vegetable patch, scattering a fine white powder over the plants. Salt or something worse. They weren't just trying to drive him out. They were performing a ritual. They were trying to cleanse his land, to make it barren and unholy in their eyes, to prove her curse was real. The girl watched through the cracks in the floorboards, her body trembling. He's salting the earth, she whispered in horror. It's what they do to the land of heretics. They make it so nothing can ever grow again. This was a new level of psychological warfare. They were destroying his life, piece by piece, right in front of him, and they were doing it with the calm, methodical patience of true believers. Suddenly, a stone crashed through the window, showering the floor with glass. Then another. They weren't shooting yet. They were trying to spook him, to break his nerve. Jack didn't flinch. He just moved away from the shattered window, his eyes scanning the yard. He had 2 shells in the shotgun. He had a pistol with 6 rounds. It wasn't nearly enough. This wasn't a fight he could win with bullets. He needed a different plan. He looked around the small cabin. His eyes landed on the fireplace, on the tin of kerosene he kept for the lamps. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. "Listen to me," he said to the girl, his voice urgent. "There's a loose board under the cot. My brother and we dug a small cellar under there when we were kids. It's not much, but it'll get you out of the house. It comes up behind the woodpile. When I give the signal, you run. You run as fast as you can toward the old creek bed. Don't stop for anything. You understand?" She stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What's the signal? What are you going to do?" "You'll know it when you see it," he said, his face grim. He grabbed the kerosene tin. "Just be ready." Outside, Thorne was growing impatient. "Enough of this! Burn him out!" 2 of the men dismounted with torches. They started walking toward the cabin, their faces illuminated by the flames they carried. They were going to burn him alive. Jack took a deep breath. He uncorked the kerosene tin and began to splash it around the front room, on the curtains, on the old wooden table, on the floorboards. The pungent smell filled the air. The girl stared at him, horror dawning on her face. "No," she whispered. "This is your home?" "It's just wood and nails," Jack said, not looking at her. "It can be rebuilt. You can't." He moved to the back of the cabin, splashing the last of the kerosene. He looked at her one last time. "Get in the cellar, now." She hesitated for a second, then scrambled under the cot and pulled at the loose floorboard. It came up with a groan of old wood, revealing a dark, narrow hole. She gave him one last look, a look that was a mix of terror and something else, something that looked almost like hope, and then she disappeared into the darkness. Jack waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the men outside, their boots crunching on the dry dirt, getting closer. He could hear Thorne shouting orders. He pulled out a match from the box on the mantelpiece, struck it. The flames sputtered to life, a tiny star of defiance in the dark room. The front door splintered as a heavy boot kicked it. A dark shape filled the doorway. "Now," Jack whispered to himself. He tossed the match. The world erupted in a whoosh of orange flame. The kerosene-soaked floorboards ignited instantly, a wall of fire roaring up between him and the door. The man in the doorway screamed and stumbled back, his clothes catching fire. Jack didn't wait to watch. He ran for the back window, the heat scorching his back. He smashed the remaining glass with the butt of his shotgun and dove through, rolling as he hit the ground. The cabin was already an inferno. Flames licked up the dry wooden walls, reaching for the night sky. The cultists were in disarray, some trying to help their burning comrade, others staring in shock at the sudden blaze. This was her signal. Jack scrambled to his feet and ran, not toward the creek, but in the opposite direction, toward the rocky outcrop at the edge of his property. He needed to draw them away from her. He fired a shot into the air. "Over here, you bastards!" he yelled. Thorne's head snapped in his direction. The shock on his face was replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. "He's getting away! Get him! Don't let him escape!" The chase was on. Jack ran, his lungs burning, the roar of the fire behind him. He could hear them crashing through the brush, shouting, their righteous certainty replaced by animalistic fury. He risked a glance back. The fire was a massive, hungry beast now, consuming the only home he had ever known. And in the flickering light, he thought he saw it. A small figure, sprinting from behind the woodpile, disappearing into the darkness of the creek bed. She was out. She was running. A bullet whistled past his ear, chipping a piece of rock off the outcrop just ahead. They were closing in. He was out of breath, out of time, and out of options. He scrambled up the rocks, seeking the high ground, his shotgun feeling heavy and useless. He was cornered. Thorne and his men fanned out below, their torches making them look like demons crawling up from the earth. "Nowhere left to run, Mercer," Thorne yelled, his voice raw with hatred. "You torched your own life for a witch. Was it worth it?" Jack looked down at them. 10 men. He had 1 shot left in the shotgun, 6 in the pistol. The math was bad, but as he looked past them, past the burning ruin of his home, he saw something else. A flicker of movement in the distance. Someone on a horse, riding hard, but not toward him. They were riding parallel to the creek bed. They were going after the girl. Thorne had been smarter than he thought. He'd sent a man to circle around, to cut off her escape. A cold, helpless fury washed over Jack. He had sacrificed everything, and it wasn't enough. They were still going to get her. Thorne smiled up at him, a predator's grin. He saw the look of despair on Jack's face. He knew he'd won. "It's over," he called out. "Surrender, and the prophet might still show you mercy." Jack looked from Thorne's smug face to the lone rider in the distance, closing in on the girl's position. He had one last impossible choice to make. And that's when he heard a new sound. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a horse. It was a scream. But it wasn't the girl's scream. It was the scream of the rider Thorne had sent after her. A short, sharp, terrified sound that was cut off abruptly. Thorne and his men all turned, their heads whipping around toward the sound. The rider's horse was visible in the moonlight, but it was riderless now. It stood there, spooked and trembling. What in God's name had just happened? A tense silence fell over the scene, broken only by the crackle of the burning cabin. Even Thorne looked confused, his victory forgotten for a moment. And then a figure emerged from the darkness of the creek bed. It was the girl, but she wasn't running anymore. She was walking, slowly, deliberately, straight toward them. In her hand, she held something long and dark, a hunting knife. Jack's knife, the one he kept by the back door. It was dripping with blood. She had circled back. She hadn't run. She had hunted. Thorne stared, his mouth agape. His men looked at each other, their fanaticism momentarily replaced by a primal fear. The girl they'd been told was a helpless, cursed creature had just taken down one of their own in the dark, without a sound. She stopped about 50 feet from them, the burning embers of Jack's home casting a demonic glow on her face. Her expression was no longer one of fear. It was a cold, hard mask of pure, concentrated rage. "You wanted me?" she said, her voice no longer a whisper. It was clear and strong, and it cut through the night air like a razor. "Here I am." The men looked at Thorne for orders, their confidence shattered. This wasn't in the prophet's holy book. Thorne recovered first, his confusion hardening back into anger. "She, devil, you see? The evil is in her. Kill her. Kill them both." But his men hesitated. They had come expecting to corner a frightened animal. They had not come expecting to face a ghost who walked out of the darkness holding a bloody knife. The superstition they'd used to control her was now working against them. They saw her, haloed by the fire, and for the first time they believed their own stories. They believed she was a curse, and she was looking right at them. Jack seized the moment. While their attention was divided, he raised his pistol, took careful aim, and shot out the torch held by the man closest to Thorne. The world was plunged into semi-darkness again, the fire from the cabin the only light. Panic erupted. The men, already spooked, started firing wildly into the darkness. They were shooting at shadows at each other. The girl didn't flinch. She used their chaos, melting back into the shadows of the creek bed as if she were born there. Thorne was screaming orders, trying to regain control, but his authority had vanished. His army of zealots had devolved into a terrified mob. Jack knew this was his only chance. He wasn't going to win a firefight, but he could win a war of fear. He fired another shot, this time hitting the ground near another man's feet, sending dirt flying. The man yelped and fell backward. "The curse is on you!" Jack roared from the rocks, his voice booming in the night. "She's marked you all!" It was a desperate gamble, using their own twisted faith against them. And it worked. One of the men broke. With a scream of terror, he turned, scrambled onto his horse, and galloped away into the night. His panic was contagious. A second man followed, then a third. In less than a minute, Thorne's posse had disintegrated. Soon only Thorne himself was left, standing amidst the chaos, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He stared at the rocks where Jack was hidden, then toward the creek bed where the girl had disappeared. He was alone. He let out a roar of pure frustration, fired one last wild shot into the night, and then mounted his own horse, turning it around and riding hard after his fleeing men. He was retreating, for now. Silence descended once again, deeper and more profound than before. The only sound was the dying hiss and crackle of the cabin as it collapsed in on itself, sending a final shower of sparks up to the indifferent stars. Jack slowly, painfully, climbed down from the rocks. His body ached. His home was a pile of smoldering ash. Everything he owned was gone, but he was alive, and so was she. He found her by the creek bed, washing the blood from the knife in the cool water. She looked up as he approached, her eyes ancient in the moonlight. The fire was gone from them, replaced by a deep, soul-crushing weariness. "They'll be back," she said, her voice flat. "The prophet will not let this go. He'll send everyone." "I know," Jack said, sinking to the ground beside her. He looked at the smoking ruins of his life. "We need to get out of here." "There's nowhere to go," she said, her voice hollow. "They have eyes everywhere. The towns, the roads. It's his territory. We'd never make it." She was right. They were trapped. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning, and they were stranded on a ruined battlefield with no allies and no shelter. Jack looked at her, this girl who had been through hell and had walked back out of it with a bloody knife in her hand. He saw the hopelessness in her eyes, the certainty that her fate was sealed. And in that moment, he felt a surge of defiance so powerful, it startled him. They had taken his home. They had taken his peace. He would be damned if he let them take his hope, too. "No," he said, his voice quiet but full of a strange new conviction. "We're not going to run. We're not going to hide." She looked at him, confused. He looked back at the ashes of his cabin, at the salted earth of his garden, and a new, terrifying plan began to form, a plan born from the ashes. "We're going to fight back," he said. "We're not going to wait for the prophet to come to us. We're going to go to him." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "That's suicide. His settlement, New Dawn, it's a fortress. He has 50 men who would die for him." "Good," Jack said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time that night. "Let's see how many of them are willing to meet their maker." He had lost everything, and he suddenly realized that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. He had spent his life running from the ghosts of his past, his brother, his lost love, his own failures. But tonight, standing in the ruins, he was done running. He looked at the girl. Her name, he learned, was Alara, and he knew their survival depended on something more than just guns and desperation. They needed help, but in a land where the law was corrupt and the people were ruled by fear, where could they possibly find it? Then he remembered something, a story his father used to tell him, a story about a ghost town, a place deep in the Badlands called Serenity, abandoned after the silver vein ran dry. But some folks said it wasn't entirely empty. They said it was a place where people went when they wanted to disappear. People running from the law, from bad debts, from their own past. Outcasts, just like them. "I know a place," Jack said, his voice gaining strength. A place the prophet's men won't think to look. A place where we might find people who hate men like him as much as we do. It was a long shot, a fool's hope, but it was the only hope they had. They took the one-horse thorns men had left behind in their panic. They had no food, no water beyond what they could carry in Jack's canteen, and only a handful of bullets between them. They were heading into the harshest part of the desert, chasing a ghost story, with a cult of fanatics hunting them. As they rode away, the first rays of dawn began to break over the mountains, casting a pale gray light on the smoldering black scar that had been Jack's ranch. Elara looked back one last time. "They destroyed it all," she whispered. "No," Jack said, looking straight ahead into the unforgiving landscape. "They just gave us a reason to build something new." The journey to Serenity was brutal. The sun was relentless, the landscape a monotonous canvas of cracked earth and skeletal brush. They rode by night and hid during the day, sheltering in caves and under rocky overhangs, conserving every drop of water, every ounce of energy. During those long, silent days, Elara began to talk. Not about the horrors, but about the life before. She spoke of the settlement, New Dawn, not as a prison, but as the only home she'd ever known. She'd been born into it. The prophet, a man named Silas Kane, had taken in her parents, lost and desperate travelers, promising them paradise. But paradise had a price: absolute obedience. "He wasn't always a monster," she explained one evening, her voice soft as she stared into their tiny, smokeless fire. "At first he was kind, charismatic. He made people feel safe. He gave them purpose. But the power, it twisted him. He started seeing threats everywhere. Doubters became sinners. Sinners became heretics. The brand," she told him, "was for those who questioned his divine authority. It was a mark of shame, meant to isolate them, to turn the community against them. It was a life sentence. My curse," she said with a bitter laugh, "was learning to read. My mother taught me in secret from an old book she'd hidden. The prophet declared all books but his own to be tools of the devil. When he found out, he made an example of her. He claimed she was possessed, and he cleansed her." Jack listened, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. This wasn't just about a murderer. It was about a tyrant who had built a kingdom on fear and lies. On the fourth day, their water ran out. The horse was stumbling, and Jack could feel the life draining out of him. He looked at Elara. She was pale, her lips cracked, but her eyes were still full of that fierce, defiant fire. She wouldn't give up, and because of her, neither would he. Just as he was about to lose hope, he saw it, a glint of reflected light in the distance. He thought it was a mirage, another lie the desert was telling him. But as they got closer, he saw the shape of a building, then another. Serenity. It was a ghost town, all right. Dilapidated buildings leaned against each other like tired old men. The wind whistled through broken windows and empty doorways. It felt dead. But as they rode down the main street, a figure stepped out of the shadows of the old saloon. A woman. She was old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, and she held a rifle with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it. "That's far enough," she said, her voice like gravel. "We're not looking for trouble," Jack called out, holding his hands up. "We're looking for sanctuary." The old woman squinted at them. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, lingered on Elara, on the exhaustion and desperation etched on her face. Then her gaze fell to Elara's forehead, to the brand that was usually hidden by her hair, but was now visible. The woman's expression changed. The hostility softened, replaced by something else. Recognition, and a flicker of ancient anger. "You've met the prophet, I see," she said, lowering the rifle slightly. "That bastard is still leaving his mark on the world." She turned and waved them forward. "Get inside, before the sun boils what's left of your brains. The name's Martha." The inside of the saloon was surprisingly clean and organized. It was clearly a communal living space. A few other people, maybe half a dozen, emerged from the back rooms. They were a motley crew, a former soldier with a prosthetic leg, a young man with the scars of a card cheat, a family that looked like they'd been run out of their last town. They were outcasts, all of them. Martha listened to Jack's story without interruption. She listened to Elara's. When they were finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Silas Kane, Martha finally said, spitting the name like a curse. He ran me and my husband off our land 20 years ago. Said it was divinely ordained. He was just a cheap grifter with a silver tongue back then. Looks like he's built himself an empire. The former soldier, whose name was Cole, spoke up. We've seen his patrols. They've been getting bolder, coming deeper into the Badlands. They're looking for something. They're looking for her, Jack said, nodding toward Alara. She's a witness to his crimes. She's the one loose end that can bring his whole holy kingdom crashing down. A debate began among the outcasts. Some wanted to help. They knew what it was like to be hunted. Others were afraid. Taking on a man like the prophet was suicide. They had come to Serenity to hide, not to fight a war. The argument grew heated, their fear battling with their conscience. Jack knew he was losing them. And then Alara stood up. She was weak, dehydrated, and still just a girl. But when she spoke, her voice commanded the room. I know you're scared, she said, her eyes moving from one face to the next. I've been scared every day of my life. But hiding from a monster doesn't make him go away. It just lets him grow stronger. He took my mother. He burned Jack's home. He will keep taking and burning until there's nothing left but his own twisted world. We can hide here and wait for him to find us, or we can take the fight to him and tear his world down before he destroys ours. She looked at Martha. You said he left his mark on me. I say we go back there, and I leave my mark on him. Her words hung in the air, filled with a power that shamed their fear into silence. Martha looked at the girl, then at the others. A slow smile spread across her wrinkled face. The girl's right, she said, picking up her rifle. I've been waiting 20 years for a chance to spit on Silas Kane's grave. Who's with me? One by one they stood up. The soldier, the card cheat, the family. They were a handful of broken people against an army of fanatics. Their chances were slim to none. But for the first time in a very long time, they weren't just hiding. They were fighting for something. The plan was insane. A direct assault on New Dawn was impossible. But Alara knew the settlement's secrets. She knew its weaknesses. The water, she said, sketching a map in the dirt floor of the saloon. The whole settlement gets its water from a single spring, deep in a canyon behind the main compound. They call it the Prophet's Well. He performs baptisms there. If we can cut off their water, we can create a diversion. We can create chaos. And she knew something else. She knew the date of the cleansing ceremony, a yearly event where the prophet delivered a sermon to his entire flock, reaffirming his power. It was in 2 days. Everyone would be gathered in the main square, unarmed. It was their only chance to get to Silas Kane himself. They spent the next day and a half preparing. They were low on guns and ammunition, but they were resourceful. They made explosives from old mining supplies found in the town's abandoned shafts. They crafted weapons. They planned. Jack watched Alara as she moved among them, her voice clear and confident as she described the layout of the settlement, the guard patrols, the prophet's habits. This was not the terrified, silent girl he had found tied to a fence post. This was a leader, a warrior forged in the fires of her own personal hell. He felt a strange sense of pride, but also a deep foreboding. He had started this to protect her. Now she was leading them all into the heart of the storm. The night of the attack, they moved like ghosts through the desert. Jack and Cole, the soldier, would handle the explosives at the spring. Martha and the others would create a diversion at the western gate. And Alara had her own mission. She was going for the prophet. He keeps records, she told Jack before they split up. A ledger. It details everyone he's cleansed, everyone he's exiled, every piece of land he's stolen. It's his one vanity, the proof of his power. It's hidden in his private chambers, behind the altar in the chapel. If I can get that book, I can expose him to his own people. I can show them the truth. It's too dangerous, Jack argued. Let me do it. No, she said, her eyes hard as steel. They need to see me, the cursed one returning, the one who survived him. It has to be me. This is my story to finish. As they neared the settlement, the sound of chanting carried on the wind. The ceremony had begun. They could see the glow of hundreds of torches from the main square. Jack and Cole slipped away toward the canyon. They moved with a silent, deadly purpose, taking out two guards with quiet efficiency. They reached the spring, a beautiful hidden oasis that felt tainted by the evil it sustained. They planted the charges, set the timers, and melted back into the shadows. Just as they were clear, a massive explosion ripped through the canyon. The rock face above the spring crumbled, sending tons of rock and dirt cascading down, choking the water source. The ground shook. In the main square, the chanting stopped. The prophet's sermon was cut short. Cries of confusion and alarm rose from the crowd. That was the signal. From the west, Martha and her small band opened fire, not at people, but at the watchtower, the bell, anything to create noise and panic. The prophet's guards, caught off guard, scrambled to respond to the attack. The crowd of followers began to scatter in terror. It was the perfect storm of chaos, and in the middle of it, a lone figure slipped through the mayhem, unnoticed, heading straight for the chapel at the heart of the compound. Elara. Jack watched from the ridge, his heart in his throat. The easy part was over. Now it was all on her. He saw her disappear inside the chapel. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The fighting at the gate intensified. The guards were starting to organize, to push back Martha's small force. Then the chapel doors burst open. The prophet, Silas Kane, emerged, dragging Elara by her hair. He held a pistol to her head. In her other hand, she clutched a thick, leather-bound ledger. He'd caught her. A triumphant, crazed look was on his face. He dragged her to the center of the square, where his followers were huddled in fear. "Behold!" he screamed, his voice amplified by a lunatic's fervor. "The demon has returned. She tried to desecrate our holy place. She is the source of this attack. The curse is real." His guards, including the formidable Elias Thorne, formed a circle around him, their guns pointed out at the chaos. Jack's blood ran cold. It was over. They had failed. But then he saw something. Elara wasn't fighting. She wasn't struggling. She was looking out at the crowd, at the faces of the people she had grown up with, and she was smiling, a small, sad smile. The prophet put the pistol to her temple. "Her evil ends now. With her death, our purity will be restored." "No!" a voice cried out from the crowd. An old woman stepped forward, then a man, then another. They were the parents of other marked children, the families of those who had been cleansed. "She is not the evil one, prophet," the old woman said, her voice shaking but clear. "You are." Silas Kane laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Fools, you are blinded by the demon's tricks. Thorne, execute them all. Purge the non-believers." But Thorne hesitated. He looked at the faces in the crowd, his own neighbors, people he knew. He saw the doubt in their eyes for the first time, and that's when Elara made her move. With a sudden, savage twist, she slammed the heavy ledger up into the prophet's face. The book, the very symbol of his tyranny, became a weapon against him. He staggered back, stunned, his nose breaking with a sickening crunch. Laura didn't stop. She wrenched free, scooped up the pistol he had dropped, and pointed it not at him, but at the sky. She fired a single shot. The sound cracked through the square, and an immediate silence fell. Every eye was on her. "He told you I was a curse," she said, her voice ringing with a power no one had ever heard from her before. "He told you I was unclean, but the only curse on this place is him. The only filth is his lies." She opened the ledger. "He told you my mother was possessed, but this book says she was cleansed because she taught a child to read. He told you Thomas Wright left in the night. This book says he was executed for questioning the tithes. It's all here. All the names, all the lies." She began to read from the book, name after name of the dead and the exiled. With every name, a gasp or a cry went up from the crowd as they recognized their lost loved ones, the truth of their fates finally revealed. The prophet's holy facade was cracking, shattering before their very eyes. He was no longer a divine messenger. He was just a man, a liar, a murderer. "She lied!" Silas screamed, clutching his bloody face. "Thorne, I command you, kill her!" Thorne looked at the prophet. He looked at Elara, holding the book of truth. He looked at the faces of his community, their expressions turning from fear to cold, hard rage. He had a choice to make between the monster he had served and the people he was meant to protect. He slowly, deliberately lowered his gun, and he shook his head. No. That single word broke the spell. The prophet's power, built on a foundation of unquestioning obedience, crumbled to dust. He was alone. With a final, desperate scream of rage, Silas lunged for Alara. Jack, who had been making his way down from the ridge, saw it happen. He raised his rifle, but he was too far away. He didn't need to be. The people, his own flock, who had once feared Alara, now moved to protect her. They swarmed their false prophet, their years of repressed grief and anger unleashed in a tidal wave of righteous fury. They pulled him down, and the man who called himself a god was consumed by the very people he had terrorized. In the aftermath, the settlement of New Dawn was quiet, not with fear, but with a kind of stunned, sober peace. The fighting had stopped. Thorn, to his credit, helped restore order, his face a mask of shame and grim resolve. Alara stood in the center of it all, not as a curse, but as a liberator. She handed the ledger to the old woman who had first spoken out. "The truth belongs to you now," she said. Jack found her as the sun began to rise, casting a new clean light over the valley. She was looking at the brand on her own reflection in a piece of broken glass. "It's over," he said softly. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, her eyes were completely clear of fear. "No," she said, "it's just beginning." They didn't stay in New Dawn. They returned to Serenity with Martha and the others, and word of what they'd done spread. Slowly at first, then like a flood. People started to arrive, not in a rush, but a slow, steady trickle. A family who had escaped a corrupt railroad baron. A man who had been branded a deserter for refusing an unjust order. Others who bore the prophet's mark, who had been living in hiding for years. They came to the ghost town, drawn by the story of the outcasts who had fought a tyrant and won. Jack, with their help, rebuilt his home. Bigger this time. Stronger. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was the first house in a new town. A town called Sanctuary. Alara never tried to remove the brand on her forehead. She wore it as a badge of honor. A reminder that scars don't have to be a symbol of what was done to you, but a testament to the fact that you survived it. She became the heart of their new community. Not a leader who demanded obedience, but one who inspired strength. The people didn't follow her out of fear. They stood with her out of love and respect. And they made a promise that their sanctuary would be a place where no one would ever be thrown away, ever be called a curse, ever be left out in the sun to die. Now let me ask you this. How many times have you seen someone who was beaten down, cast out, and labeled as worthless, only to watch them rise up and become stronger than anyone ever thought possible? The world is full of people who will try to tell you what you are. They'll try to brand you with your failures, with their own fears and prejudices. But stories like this, they remind us that the only person who gets to decide who you are is you. If this story reminded you of the strength it takes to fight back against the darkness and build something new from the ashes, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are a lot more stories out here about the quiet heroes and the unexpected sanctuaries, and you're not going to want to miss a single one.